Friends, peace be with you. Assalamu alaikum. We present now the third episode of the third topic of the summer course. It is an interesting topic, say, teaching, movements and experience of love in Islam, focusing on some Muslim models and traditions. If you remember the second topic, something similar about Christianity, now about Islam. And we have with us a dear friend. He has been also our director of the Silsila Dialogue Institute. He is a professor of the Western Mindanao State University and different responsibility in communities. Now, Professor Ali Ayub, our friend, will present to us this topic. And because the topic, we can say, talk about spirituality, even Professor Ali talk about Sufism, we decide to start our presentation with a short documentary about Sufism. You know, and probably you hear more, how important is the spiritual aspect also in Islam, and how Sufism in the history have been very relevant. Actually, if you remember or you know something about Silsila, in our understanding is something in that line. We want to put the spiritual element as a Christian, as a Muslim, or people of other faith. Even we choose a word silsila, that chain, that recall in some way a way or spiritual journey of the Sufism. So means in the spiritual language there are points in common. Only this, I hope you will appreciate this presentation. So we will start with this short documentary, and after we listen Professor Ali Ayub.
Today, let's have a look at the Sufi movement. We are going to discuss about the time period 11th century onwards, when a large number of Sufis from Central Asia began to settle in Hindustan. The term used in the Islamic text for Sufism is tasawwuf. The origin of this term is interpreted by historians in different ways. Some believe that it is derived from the term safa, which in Arabic means purity. According to some scholars, it is derived from suf, meaning wool, referring to the coarse woolen clothes worn by the Sufis. And some historians derived Sufism or tasawwuf from sufa, that is, the platform outside the Prophet Muhammad's mosque where a group of close followers assembled to learn about Islam. Coming to the Sufi movement. The Sufi movement was a socio-religious movement which stood against the growing materialism in religious institutions. The Sufis did not attach importance to namaz, hajj and celibacy. The union of the human soul with God through love and devotion was the essence of the teachings of the Sufi saints. So, the term Sufism is synonymous to the ideology which believes that purity of thought and conduct would draw us closer to the God. The Sufis emphasized on seeking salvation through intense devotion and love for God by following His commands and following the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad, whom they regarded as a perfect human being. Now, let's have a look at some Sufi institutions and practices. Sufis began to organize communities or held their assemblies in their khanqahs. These khankas were hospices or house of rest for religious travelers. Khankas comprised several small rooms and a big hall called Jamaat Khana. Khankas also became the centers where people discussed spiritual matters, sought the blessings of the saints in solving their worldly problems. These khankas were controlled by a teaching master known as Sheikh or Peer or Murshid. These masters enrolled their students or disciples known as murids. Masters also appointed a successor called Khalifa. The chain from masters to disciples was a continuous link, forming one order of Sufi saints or silsila. There are many Sufi silsilas like Qadiri silsila, Chishti silsila, etc. These silsilas were often named after their founders. Like Chishti silsila was named after its founder Muinuddin Chishti. Sufi Saint Muinuddin Chishti and his followers together formed Chishti silsila. These saints were given status of masters with miraculous powers that could relieve others of their illnesses and troubles. The tomb called Dargah of these saints also became the center of devotion for their followers. This encouraged the practice of pilgrimage called ziyarat to the graves of these Sufi saints. The followers often go for ziyarat on the death anniversary or urs of these saints, as people believed that in death saints are united with God and thus were closer to Him. Thus, these Sufi saints began to be called as Sheikh or Wali, that is, friends of God. Also part of ziyarat is the use of music and dance as a part of devotion and worship to God. The Sufis believed that the heart can be trained to look at the world in a different way. They developed elaborate methods of training using zikr, that is, chanting of sacred name, contemplation, sama or singing, raqs or dancing, discussion of parables or moral lessons, etc., under the guidance of a master or peer. The best part of the Sufi movement was the idea to inculcate a humanistic attitude amongst people. They had spread the message of social and religious equality and harmony. This message of love and harmony makes the ideology of Sufism meaningful even today.
Thank you very much, Father. I will be sharing the topic assigned to me, teachings, movements and experiences of love in Islam, focusing on some Muslim models and traditions. Now, let me start from the Quran. We talk about the image of God, and it's very clear from the different chapters in the Quran. It starts with in the name of God, most gracious, most compassionate. So the image of God, it's the most gracious and the most compassionate. And the attributes of God being portrayed in the Quran, very clear, the summary of those in two words, Rahman and Rahim, most gracious and most compassionate. And of course, when we talk about the evolution of theology in Islamic tradition and different movements, there are also different interpretations. So you have, I think even also in Christianity, you have schools of thought, and you have different movements, and you have different traditions. But very interesting in Islamic history, there is this so-called spiritual movement. And of course, we cannot deny the fact that when power and religion is not being, separated, so there will be abuse of power and sometimes using religion. And the history of Islam, I think even after the death of the Prophet, there were, rivalry in terms of leadership, and political, rivalry took root in the history of Islam. And there were conflicts among Muslims. And aside from that, there were conflicts also with the other religion, because religion became the center of power. So there's a movement within the Islamic Ummah to revive the very nature of Islam, the spirituality of Islam. And this is very interesting because the focus is more on the love of God and love of neighbor. And this group of people, they call themselves the Sufis. I think the emphasis of the Sufis is more on the image of God that is of Rahman and Rahim. And their teachings is more emphasis on love, and these attributes of God must be manifested in the way of life, in dealing with others. So this is very important, because in the history of Islam, this group of people could easily get along with other people, with other religion. I think when we revisit the history, when Islam came to Andalus and in contact with the West, and we have read about, you have Ibn Sina, you have also encounters with these personalities like Imam Ghazali, Rumi, and many others. And they have encountered with mystical people also from the West. And if I'm not mistaken, Imam Ghazali had also contacts with spiritual people from the West. And even also Ibn Arabi had also contact, if I'm not mistaken, Saint Francis. And if you read their prayers, and with the prayers of Saint Francis, almost identical. So these spiritual people, they have shared their spiritual experiences, and also they have found a common ground. And that common ground is beyond doctrines, beyond rituals, because rituals and doctrines, we differ. And even among ourselves, in terms of doctrinal teachings, there are different schools of thought. But the common ground, I think, and based from their experience, is the spirituality. And we have to reach that level. And that's the common ground for all. And in that level, I think what we have experienced, and even today, that we can appreciate others, that we will see others according to their own faith, but of course, deepening your own faith also. For example, when I my encounter with other faiths, so it will not I'm not afraid of dealing with others. I'm not, you know, compromising my faith. In fact, it will, you know, motivate me and inspire me to work with others, because I have that motivation that all of us are the same in terms of the spirit within us and the orientation within us, although we only differ in terms of interpretations, in terms of the rituals. But when we go to the roots of our faith, I think all of the religious masters, they speak the same language. Now, these people, I mean, people like Imam Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and others, they were the towering figure in the Muslim world that, you know, counter move to the political Islam. I think in Christianity, there were also people who said politics is politics, religion is religion. So we have to distinguish. I think this is one of the dilemma. I think even in the Muslim world, the distinction between religion and politics. If you cannot distinguish this one, there will be confusion and there will be exploitation and manipulation. Like in the past, I think Europe, the Dark Ages, it was because religion was used to justify for power. So that's why conflict, you know, and even in the Muslim world, and even today, the conflict in the Muslim world, it's because of rivalry in political power. So when we say Islamic tradition, I would suggest that we have to highlight the spiritual, we have to restore the real teaching of Islam. Because when we say the real teaching of Islam, the very image of God in the Quran is very clear that He is most gracious and He is most merciful. So those two attributes, the summary of all the attributes, must be manifested in our way of life and in dealing with others. I think that's the very short I can share about love in Islam when citing few people bringing that message further.
Okay, thank you very much. You brought to us the essential part of this message of love in Islam. And of course we have been sharing these things sometimes, and you know how even Silsila started with this idea to go to the spiritual level, and there we could have a ground of dialogue, no? And in some occasion I mentioned that thanks to I was able to study also Islam in Rome, and the encounter with Sufi and the spirituality has been quite a good influence also in deciding the word silsila, in deciding also the orientation to give to the movement with the more clear spiritual point, because as you said, it's a common ground. Now, of course, this for sure our listener could learn a lot from this. And can you explain more what is happening today? Why this voice of the Sufi that is so important for us, it's not so much emerging? Even I know some good friends who are inclined to be Sufi, but they try not to say very openly. What is the fear to make the Sufi movement to emerge and to make more clear the spiritual point? Do you have any answer?
I think in terms of academic discussion, it's flourishing in Europe and America, this school of thought, this Sufism. But in the Middle East, in most of the Muslim countries, they suppress this teaching. And I think in universities, I have learned, based on my research, few universities, part of the curriculum, this tasawwuf, this subject of tasawwuf. I think this is Sufism in English. In Al-Azhar University is being taught up to now. But in other universities, they removed that one, especially from the Middle East countries, because according to them, this is a innovation. It's not real Islam. So they want to push the political Islam. I think the institutions, the government has something, has role to play in suppressing this one. But of course not in other countries, like we talk about very strong in Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, and I think in the Middle East, Cairo and other neighboring countries, but definitely not in Saudi Arabia, in Syria, Sudan. These are, but when you study carefully this movement, it's growing, and even here in our country, there are sizable people who adhere to this teaching, but they are silent, they are silent, they don't want to, but I think that's part also of the tariqah, of the path, that you have to be, you don't have to show, and you don't have to, when you do something good, you don't have to, announce it to people. So they don't go to symposium, they don't go public lecture, but they do, they have their own way of convincing people. If you go to ordinary people, Father, I have been to remote areas in the countryside. I have been to Sulu, to Basilan, and also to the mainland. If you go to speak to the old people, they call it Kamazan in Tauzug, they still bring that teaching, Father.
Yes.
Yes.
I know, because even myself, I have a lot of friends, but when I say why we do not make a voice, they say, no, Father, it's not the time. Something is not the time. Means we have to wait, it's not prudent, this and that. And you mentioned the old people are in that line. The new ones, what happened? The Islam of the old and the Islam of today.
Yeah, I think this is one of the challenges for us, not only in Mindanao, but I think it's global phenomenon that, there's new breed of young people with this, new teaching. It's not new teaching. According to them, they're the original. But if you study carefully, they are the literalists. I think very fundamentalist. They stick to the literal. When they read the Quran and they read the hadith of the Prophet, that's it. No more context. The literal meaning. It's sometimes misleading because these young new breed of so-called ulama, they are trained and conditioned just to select verses that, contextually, it's during the time of war, during the time of conflict, during the time of, Makkah and Medina, they were, attacked by the surrounding, very hostile people. So that was the context, and they bring that to the teaching of today. So without, you know, discussing the context, I think that's the problem, because when we go back to the classical Islam, Islam flourished because of, you know, literature, poetry, and all of the writings, more on, you know, spirituality, contemplative, all of this. But the contemporary interpretation of Islam is, you know, re-emergence of, you know, political Islam. We need to take power. We need to get power. So I think this is one of the challenges, that we have to restore again the essence of the teaching of Islam to the classical interpretation and to the spiritual side of Islam, because it's being hijacked nowadays, and we cannot deny the fact what is going on. You talk about September 11 happened in our own Zamboanga siege, and recently Marawi siege. You know, they have this interpretation of the old, you know, verses from the Quran. They just, you know, pick some verses, and also hadith of the Prophet, without, you know, explaining the context.
Yes, I know this. But why they are so powerful, and they say, no, the Quran is this one, yesterday and today, so we are obliged to do this. And so that is their understanding, maybe. And who give the teaching to these young people in this way? And practically, what we can do to go back, because the topic you said beautifully, the spiritual aspect, how to go back to that beautiful.
I think globally speaking, Father, there are already initiatives being taken by religious leaders. I think the prominent in the global, you know, community pushing for dialogue, I think the Sheikh al-Azhar is one. Of course, the King of Jordan also is pushing, and there are ulama in the global community, you know, working together to counter. And in fact, they are what do you call this, declarations by these ulama, and telling these people, in terms of giving fatwa or giving opinion, is not easy. You have to follow the process, ijma. And one of the processes of, you know, the to give fatwa is to follow the process of consensus building. And doing consensus, expert in religion should be council of people. It's not one individual. And I think this is the danger, individual. But I think globally, and I think they are pushing, and I think they are also exerting efforts at government level and community level. And in fact, they want also to standardize the curricula of the, I think, Islamic institutions and even madrasa. So there are collaborations already, Father. The religious leaders from the Muslim different countries, they come together and made a declaration, and they even also open dialogue with other faiths. I think they were also conferences by this Sheikh al-Azhar and with the Pope. And recently, I think the Pope visited Iraq and other countries.
Of course, so 2 years ago, Abu Dhabi, with a beautiful document.
Exactly.
Yes, human fraternity.
Yes, I think it's gaining ground. I'm sure, and this is the hope.
So we can continue our mission.
Of course.
You said about the King of Jordan. I remember that we were together in Amman to represent the Silsila for a prize of King Abdullah gave to us. And what to say, those who know you, they know that you are doing a lot in that direction. So maybe for this point I can say, maybe what we can create a more space that the so-called ijma, the consensus of the Muslim family will be more spiritual, to make decision a little bit in the spirit you mentioned before, El-Rahman El-Rahim, God merciful and compassionate, no? What to say? You say the last few words, so conclude.
Yes, thank you for this opportunity to share with you, Father. I think this is one of the challenges, and I think our role to restore the real teaching of Islam, and we have to be serious, because what's going on is giving us the imperative to do more, and we can, creatively, there are many ways to spread the message of love, and Islam is the message of peace and message of love. So we need, it's not just teaching, but also forming, I think, the persons, because we have to live this kind of life. It's not just through preaching, but doing the right thing. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you also to you, and of course our listener will really benefit of this lesson. Thank you very much. We already heard something about this episode, this topic, and hopefully you can take these things to share in your group. We will do during the summer course. Others could do also in other occasions. Of course, we know that many other things can be said, and I hope that this is a kind of entry point to understand that also in Islam there is this spiritual journey. Sometimes I'm afraid that people see only negative things, because unfortunately we have some groups who use violence using the name of Islam. We have to be realistic. The world is so complicated now, and unfortunately there are groups who misunderstand religion or misuse religion for their own purpose. So this is in general. I invite all of you to depend all these things, and for sure we will learn more, and we learn that at the end we maintain our faith. We are called to maintain our faith, but to believe that the Lord is working in us in the deeper part, that is the spiritual journey.